On July 10, 2012, at Seversky Pond in Polevskoye, two fishermen noticed something that had drifted to the shore. At first, they thought it was trash, a snag, a scrap of fabric. They walked closer and dropped their rods. What had washed ashore was wrapped in a heavy iron chain, several loops around the neck, several around the torso. The chain was pulled tight, wound with clear intent, so that the discovery would sink to the bottom and stay there forever. But due to decomposition, it eventually surfaced, and the current carried it to the opposite bank of the pond. The condition was severe. Prolonged time in water made identification virtually impossible. The face, the hands, nothing could be read. The only thing relatively preserved was the clothing, and it was the clothing that would later help establish who had been found that day. Polevskoye is a small city in the Sverdlovsk region, a few thousand residents. The main employer is the Seversky pipe plant, around which essentially the entire city grew, a quiet, insular place where everyone knows each other. And here, at the pond where people walk with their families, where they fish on weekends, where they swim in the summer, this is what turned up. The fishermen called the police. A patrol arrived. The area was cordoned off. But to understand who was found that day, we need to go back 5 days, to when a woman named Lyudmila simply didn't show up for work. On July 6, 2012, Lyudmila Kuryanova didn't show up for her taxi shift. She was 60 years old and worked every single day. No days off, no absences, no exceptions. She'd get behind the wheel of her own car early in the morning and head out on the route. For her to simply not appear and not warn anyone, that had never happened in all her years of working. Her family started worrying around midday. First they called. The phone was silent. Nothing. Then they drove to her house. The door was locked, the yard was empty, the car was gone. No notes, no signs of a hurried departure, not a single clue. And from that moment, the search began. Igor, Lyudmila's older son, along with his brother, checked the nearby garages, drove through the residential neighborhoods, stopped by acquaintances, former colleagues from the plant, asked the neighbors. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard anything. Lyudmila had seemingly vanished. In a city where everything is in plain sight, where every face is familiar, it seemed impossible. A woman couldn't just disappear without a trace. But that's exactly what happened. And at that moment, neither Igor nor his younger brother yet knew that the discovery at Seversky Pond 4 days later was their mother. They were still hoping, still believing she was somewhere out there, that it was a mistake, that she'd come back. But there was one person who knew exactly where Lyudmila had been the evening before, and that person stayed silent. For much of her life, she worked as an accountant at the Seversky pipe plant, the main employer in Polevskoye. Working there was considered stable, reliable. She knew numbers, documents, financial reports. Her colleagues at the plant valued her. They spoke well of her. Calm, meticulous, never had conflicts with anyone. But at some point, she was laid off. And in 2010, her husband passed away. 2 blows in a row. Her job and the man she'd spent decades with. Lyudmila was left alone. Her 2 adult sons, Igor and his younger brother, lived separately, each with their own families. They'd visit, check in, but in her daily life, she was on her own. Her pension didn't cover expenses, and she couldn't sit idle. She'd spent her whole life working, being needed, staying in motion. So she made a decision. She had her own car, and Lyudmila took a job driving a taxi, every morning behind the wheel, out on the route. For a 60-year-old woman, it wasn't an easy choice, but she managed. She earned a living, depended on no one, stayed on her feet. Those close to her remember. Mom was a kind person, loved life, doted on her grandchildren, tried never to give up. And it was in the taxi business that Lyudmila met the man who would change everything and end it all. Among the taxi drivers of Polevskoye was a man named Vasily. Like Lyudmila, he also worked in his own car. According to those who knew him, charming, talkative, the kind of person who could put anyone at ease. In a small town, taxi drivers know each other. They cross paths at the stands, exchange a few words between fares, share routes. That's how Lyudmila and Vasily started talking. First about work, then it got closer. Shared shifts, shared routes, conversations over tea at the taxi stand. At some point, it became a relationship. But there was a detail that made this story complicated from the very beginning. Vasily was married. He had a family, a home, a settled life, everything in place. A wife, grown sons. To everyone around him, he was a family man, dependable, solid. And Lyudmila became his parallel life, a secret his wife was never supposed to find out about. He'd come to see her, spend time, then go back to his family. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary affair, something warm. But Lyudmila fairly quickly sensed that something was off about Vasily. She didn't talk about it openly, didn't complain to acquaintances, but she did confide in one person, her sister. She said it directly. She was afraid of him. According to Lyudmila, Vasily had allegedly been convicted of a crime in the past. She didn't specify what exactly, but the very fact that she said it out loud speaks volumes. Lyudmila wasn't the type to exaggerate or create drama out of nothing. If she told her sister, it means she was genuinely afraid. And here's the question that many will surely ask. If she was afraid, why didn't she leave? Why did she keep seeing him, letting him into her home, into her life? It's probably not that simple. A small town, the loss of a husband, loneliness, age. When you're 60 and you've buried the person you spent your whole life with, any semblance of closeness feels important, even if that closeness makes you anxious. Most likely, Vasily wasn't the kind of person you easily walk away from. There's a type of person who keeps you close not with affection, but with pressure, not with direct threats, but with the feeling that you depend on them. Especially in Polevskoy, where everyone knows everyone, and leaving doesn't just mean closing a door, it means restructuring your entire life. Lyudmila probably thought she could handle it, that it was just his personality, a man's roughness. Nothing serious, but very soon she would step outside one morning and discover that her car, her only source of income, was gone. Lyudmila lived in a private house on the outskirts of Polevskoy, not far from Seversky Pond, a quiet neighborhood, single-story houses, fences, vegetable gardens, gravel roads. In the summer, greenery and stillness. In the evenings, you'd hear only birds. In winter, waist-deep snow and smoke from the chimneys. In the yard stood a doghouse. It once housed a German shepherd, a big, serious dog on a sturdy chain. But by that point, the dog had already passed. The doghouse remained standing empty, and the chains still hung on it, heavy, metal, with thick links. Nobody had removed it, taken it away, or thrown it out. It was simply part of the yard, like the fence, like the gate. Lyudmila continued living there alone. In the morning, she'd leave for work. In the evening, she'd come back and close the gates. Her sons visited on weekends, sometimes bringing the grandchildren. They'd run around the yard, play near the doghouse. Life was steady and quiet. The pond was just a few minutes' walk from her house, a path through the residential area, past the fences, and there was the shore. In the summer, people fished there, went for walks. In winter, it was empty, no one around. Now, this proximity of the house to the water and that chain on the empty doghouse in the yard, remember these two details, because both of them will return in this story, and the context in which they'll reappear will be entirely different. On July 5th, 2012, Lyudmila's neighbor was in his yard. An ordinary summer evening. Warm, a long day, no commotion. At some point, he heard a car pull up to Lyudmila's house. Doors slammed. 2 people got out, Lyudmila and a man. Later, the neighbor would say it was Vasily. He'd seen him before. And then, raised voices. Not screaming, not a full-blown argument, but clearly not a peaceful conversation. What exactly it was about, he couldn't make out. The fence, the distance, the noise of an evening yard. Who knows? A couple arguing. That's not unusual in the residential neighborhoods. Everyone hears everything and everyone's learned not to get involved. He finished his food, went inside, went to bed, and by the next morning, Lyudmila was already gone. The house was locked. Silence. No movement. The neighbor didn't worry even then. Maybe she went somewhere. But then the relatives showed up, the questions started, and only then did he remember. On the evening of the 5th, she'd been home with Vasily, and something was happening between them. This was significant to the whole case, but his testimony would truly be heard only 13 years later, under circumstances no one could have foreseen. When investigators began working with the discovery at the pond, one of the first questions was, where did the chain come from? It wasn't industrial, not from construction, not from a hardware store. By the type of links, by the length, by the characteristic wear marks, it matched a dog chain. And the chain had simply been lying in the yard, accessible to anyone who knew it. Essentially only one person besides Lyudmila herself. The investigation reached a conclusion. The act most likely took place right on the property, in the yard or inside the house. The chain was taken from the doghouse, used right there, and then the pond. A few minutes on foot through the residential area, at night in a neighborhood with no cameras and no streetlights, where the streets are empty after 10 p.m., this could be done unnoticed. The sequence of events came together clearly. Investigators understood where it happened. They understood what had been wrapped around the remains. The main question remained, who? And the suspect was obvious. The man who was seen at Lyudmila's house on the evening of July 5th, the man who had access to her yard, the man she feared. Shortly before Lyudmila's disappearance, her car was set on fire. For an ordinary person, that's a serious setback. For a taxi driver, a catastrophe. The car was her only source of income. Without it, Lyudmila couldn't go out on the road, couldn't earn, couldn't pay her bills, couldn't support herself. Who set the fire was never determined. A police report was filed, an investigation was conducted, but it led nowhere. No witnesses, no cameras, no leads. In a small town, someone usually sees things like that. But in this case, silence, and so Lyudmila was left with nothing to fall back on. No husband, he had passed 2 years earlier. No factory job, she'd been laid off. Now no car. 60 years old, alone in a private house on the edge of town. But she didn't break. She didn't wait for help, didn't ask her sons. Instead, she made a decision. She took out a loan, about 200,000 rubles. The goal was simple: buy a new car and get back to driving a taxi. At the time, it looked like the act of a strong person, a woman that life kept knocking down, getting back up and taking action. But that 200,000 would play an entirely different role in this story. Lyudmila took out the loan, received the money in hand. But then something strange happened. She never bought a car? The money vanished. Not partially, not in small amounts. The entire sum simply dissolved. Where she put it, who she gave it to, or who took it from her? The case files had no answer to that at the time. Lyudmila's relatives would later say they had no idea where the money went. No car was bought, no major purchases were made, no new debts appeared either. The 200,000 seemed to have fallen into a void. And here's what's important to understand. Between the moment the money disappeared and the moment Lyudmila herself disappeared, very little time had passed. A few weeks. First the torched car, then the loan that went nowhere, and then the woman simply didn't show up for work, and 4 days later she was found at the pond. Each of these facts on its own might mean nothing, but together they form a very specific picture. And the first person the detectives went to after the discovery was Vasily. The detectives got to Vasily quickly. He was the last person Lyudmila had been seen with. Neighbors confirmed. On the evening of July 5th, he was at her house. A logical suspect, the first and most obvious lead. But when they started talking to him, Vasily behaved unexpectedly, confident, calm, without the slightest sign of anxiety. His story was short and clear. We broke up, haven't been in contact for a while, I don't know where she is. No hesitation, no contradictions, no nervousness. A man suspected of involvement in the disappearance of a woman he'd been seeing, answering as if he were being asked about something completely unrelated. For the investigation, this was alarming. That kind of composure in an ordinary person in such a situation is atypical, but technically, there was nothing to pin on him. We broke up. It happens. We don't talk. That's his right. Don't know where she is. Why should he? The detectives recorded his statement and continued working other angles. Vasily went home, to his family, to his wife, to his usual routine. And at that point, neither the investigators nor Lyudmila's relatives could have imagined that within a few days, this calm and self-assured man would do something no one expected. The remains were identified by the clothing. The forensic examination confirmed it was Lyudmila Kuryanova. The funeral was held at the Seversky Cemetery, closed casket. Saying a proper goodbye, seeing her face, a farewell kiss on the forehead, none of that was possible. Time in the water had left no such opportunity. Many people came to the cemetery, from the plant where Lyudmila once worked. Nearly everyone knew her. Former colleagues, accountants, neighbors, acquaintances from the taxi business. Just people from the town. Small Polevskoy was burying one of its own. Igor and his younger brother stood at the grave in silence. Next to them, their grandfather. He was already past 80, standing with a cane, looking at the closed casket, and most likely thinking that no parent should outlive their sons and daughters, especially not like this, without a face, without a farewell, without an answer to the question of who did this. At that point, the case was formally moving forward. Investigators were working, conducting interviews, gathering evidence, but the prime suspect was free. Vasily walked the same streets, drove through the same town, lived in the same house. Then something happened that should have put an end to it. Detectives continued working Vasily. They called him in for questioning, asked the same questions from different angles. And at some point, what they'd been waiting for happened. He confessed. Said, "Yes, it was me." Exactly what he said, what details he provided, what he described. None of that has been made public. But the fact itself was documented. The suspect admitted his involvement in what happened to Lyudmila. For the investigation, it was a breakthrough. The first glimmer of hope that the system would work, that the guilty party would answer for it, that the justice they'd been waiting for since that day at the closed casket would finally come. A suspect's confession is, as a rule, the beginning of the end of an investigation. After it come verifications, clarifications, forensic reviews, trial. It seemed like all that was left was to go through the formalities and bring it to a verdict. And here we need to stop and say one thing. What happened next turned this entire story upside down, because Vasily had the right to a phone call and he used it. He called not relatives, not his wife, not friends. He called a lawyer. After the conversation with the lawyer, Vasily understood everything. There was no direct evidence linking him to the act. No biological traces, no camera footage, no witnesses from the actual moment. Yes, the chain from the doghouse. Yes, he was at her place on the evening of the 5th. Yes, the neighbor heard an argument. But all of it was circumstantial. None of it pointed directly, conclusively, irrefutably, to him being the one who did it. And Vasily made a complete 180, a full retraction of all statements. I didn't say anything, I was pressured, I was coerced, I'm not guilty. Everything he'd told the investigators an hour earlier was crossed out by one conversation with a lawyer. The confession that was supposed to become the foundation of the prosecution turned into nothing. Without direct evidence, the case stalled. A dead end. Everyone understood who did it. The neighbor saw him at the house, the chain from her yard, the connection between them obvious. And still, legally insufficient. Technically, there was nothing to hold on to. Vasily walked out of the office, got in his car, and drove away. Back to his wife and his usual life. And that usual life would last another 13 years. The investigation continued working, but without direct evidence, there was nowhere to go. Lyudmila's relatives reached out to the media, asked for witnesses, anyone at all, to come forward. They published her photos, described the circumstances, provided contact information. Nobody called, nobody came. Not a single new lead. The case gradually went into the archives. A folder with a number, a shelf, and Vasily lived. He retired, stopped driving a taxi, family, wife. His sons knew one thing about him: caring, domestic, everything for the home, everything for the family. Grandchildren came along, and he doted on them, drove out to the dacha, traveled, lived a measured life, in a quiet town. Neighbors said hello, acquaintances smiled. To everyone around him, he was that kind of grandfather, quiet, dependable, harmless. Meanwhile, just a few blocks from his house, at the Seversky Cemetery, stood Lyudmila's grave. And every year, Igor and his brother came there, brought flowers. 13 years of that contrast, him with his grandchildren, her with a grave. And over those years, those who had waited for justice the longest passed on. Lyudmila's father, Igor and his brother's grandfather. He never saw a trial, an indictment, or even a single step forward. He stood at that closed casket and most likely believed the system would work, that the guilty party would be found. Years passed. Nothing changed. And he left this world without ever seeing justice. Lyudmila's neighbor, the very one who had been grilling in his yard on the evening of July 5th and heard the raised voices, also passed away. Time takes its toll, especially in small towns where medical care isn't always nearby and the distance to hospitals is measured in hours. But before he went, he did one thing that would prove decisive. He gave testimony, detailed, documented, recorded by investigators. What exactly he said has not been made public, but that testimony went into the case file and stayed there, a folder with a number, a shelf, into the archive, and it seemed like that's where it would stay for decades, just paper that no one would ever open again. But then something changed. In the investigative committee of the Sverdlovsk region, leadership changed, and the new person decided to read what was sitting in those folders. In 2025, leadership of the Sverdlovsk regional office changed. The new head was likely General Bogdan Francisco, and one of his first decisions was to order a review of unsolved cases from previous years, to re-examine, reassess, reinvestigate the Koryanova case, 2012, Polevskoy, Seversky Pond, the discovery in chains. Investigators opened materials that hadn't been touched in years, reread the protocols, the testimony, the findings. And among everything else, they found those very statements from the neighbor, the ones he'd given shortly before passing away. What he said still hasn't been disclosed, but the new team saw something in that testimony that the previous investigators hadn't seen or hadn't been able to use. In 13 years, much had changed. Technology had advanced significantly. Forensic analyses that simply didn't exist in 2012 had become available and routine. What was impossible to prove back then was now a matter of time and one properly ordered examination, and the investigation ordered that examination. The investigative committee ordered a comprehensive forensic review. The remains were re-examined, cross-referenced with Lyudmila's medical records that had been preserved in hospital and clinic archives. Back then, such analysis was far less precise and accessible. Every witness still alive was re-interviewed, colleagues, relatives, neighbors. They gathered everything they could find after 13 years. What exactly the forensic review revealed has not been disclosed. The investigation is keeping that information sealed, and that's understandable. The case hasn't reached trial yet, and premature disclosure could hurt the prosecution. But the results were sufficient to do what they couldn't do 13 years ago. Vasily was 70 by then, long retired, surrounded by family, grandchildren, the dacha, evening television, a measured life. And then people in uniform came to his door with a formal indictment. For 13 years, he'd lived as if nothing had happened, and those 13 years had come to an end. Vasily was brought to court for a detention hearing, and that's when the performance began. A 70-year-old man who had been out walking with his grandchildren and visiting his dacha just yesterday suddenly clutched his chest. He felt ill, couldn't stand, demanded medical attention. The court assessed his condition and decided not to place him under arrest. He was released on his own recognizance. His family, his wife, his sons, rallied to his defense. On camera, for the journalists, they all said the same thing. A man with a heart of gold. Everything for the family, everything for the home. He's not capable of something like this. On the other side of the courtroom sat Igor, the older son, who had waited 13 years for this moment. He came with one purpose, to look Vasily in the eyes, but Vasily looked away. Not once during the entire hearing did he look in Igor's direction, didn't turn his head, didn't raise his eyes. He did not admit guilt, same position as 13 years ago, not guilty, not involved, don't know anything. He is currently reviewing the case materials. After that, the prosecutor will sign the formal indictment, and the case will finally go to the Polevskoy court. He looked away because he knew. The question that has hung over this story from the very beginning: why? What drove a 70-year-old retired grandfather to take the life of a woman he'd been seeing? If you put together everything we've learned, the picture begins to take shape. First, money. The 200,000 rubles in loan money that Lyudmila took out and that vanished without a trace. It can be assumed that Vasily was directly involved, took it, extracted it, kept it. Second, fear. Lyudmila knew about his past, about his criminal record. She was someone who could destroy his family life, tell his wife, his sons. Third, control. The torched car was likely no accident. Most likely it was a way to strip her of her independence, to keep her tethered to him. But Lyudmila didn't break. She took out a loan and was planning to get back to driving a taxi. And that made her even more dangerous. She knew too much and was no longer dependent on him. The evening of July 5th, the argument the neighbor heard, was likely the final breaking point. Fear of exposure, loss of control, everything converged in one evening. He faces up to 15 years. The case that was silent for 13 years will finally speak in court. Write what you think about this story. Hit like, subscribe to our channel. See you next time.